APUS government students, I'm back. 4.2. We're focusing today on the powers of Congress, all right? So, and we'll see that the powers differ between the House and the Senate. We first start by looking at the express powers, all right? And so these are housed Article 1, Section 8. The biggest ones there you can see there in brown: tax, spend, borrow, and interstate commerce. All right, tax is the one that impacts us greatly. All right, it'll impact you every year for the rest of your life. All right, spending, this is something we'll talk about on the back end of this lecture. Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, have a huge spending problem, spending way too much money. All right, versus the amount of money that they take in, which is creating a deficit. They're having to borrow money. All right, and then interstate commerce, we've talked about that a number of different times. That is one of the big enumerated powers that Congress has. We also talked about, as we move on to the red, the necessary and proper clause, the back end of Section 8. All right, the implied powers that comes from McCollum versus Maryland. All right, so you can see how over time this has allowed Congress to create far-reaching laws based upon this implied power from McCollum versus Maryland. First, banks, minimum wage, tied to discussions of the economy. All right, talking about environment, think EPA, clean air, water standards. Social, mentioned. All right, thinking outlawing workplace discrimination. Some criminal stuff. All right, think back to criminal laws. Though not a lot of federal criminal laws, but there are some, most definitely. All right, let's now look at the jobs of Congress. All right, now I use the mnemonic oil. All right, and I do that on purpose. Obviously, it makes sense. But it just so happens that the O, the I, and the L, in my opinion, I think we could argue pretty strongly that this is probably the order of which I would say things are important to folks in Congress these days. Whereas most people, on a basic sense, would say, well, they're just dealing with passing laws, and that's what they do a majority of the time. I would argue that they don't. They don't pass as many laws as they used to. It's a difficult process. It is a process we talked about in our last lecture that requires bipartisanship. That in today's day and age, it's more difficult to gather to get those bills to the president's desk. So I think we could argue pretty strongly today that oversight of the executive is something that Congress takes a lot of time doing. You know, making sure that the trillions of dollars that they're passing out to the executive branch is being spent and being spent in ways in which they want it to be spent. All right. So that is a big power of Congress. That power of the purse, dividing up the money, sending it to various agencies, various parts of the executive branch that we'll talk about in our next chapter. And then certainly bringing people in from the executive branch and asking them how that money's being spent. All that oversight, hugely important, I believe, of the executive, something that's overlooked by many. Investigation. This is a big thing that Congress continues to do. You know, anyone, any company, anytime. This subpoena power that our Congress, specifically the House, has to investigate people. We'll see some questions. We'll see some things where we talk about that ability. And where does that come from by and large? Where do they get the power to bring in Major League Baseball players? Where do they get the power to bring in Mark Zuckerberg or, you know, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies? Interstate commerce. Interstate commerce. And then lawmaking, there it is. Yes, has importance, continues, will always have importance. But you see, I almost place it in third place. But the doings of that is back in lecture 1. All right. Specific powers of the House and the Senate. All right. So not super exciting stuff, but important stuff. Investigations, as I mentioned, in the House. Revenue bills start there. Whoop, whoop. Impeachment investigations, and that's something that you've seen in your lifetime happen a number of times, and they continue to be talked about a lot in Washington D.C. It seems like impeachment is thrown around a lot more these days than I would argue it did when I was your age. It was a big deal, when I was growing up, and there was the impeachment talk of President Bill Clinton. I don't think it had ever really been talked about, before that in the 80s. I don't think there was a big talk about it in the late 70s. Certainly there was talk about it in the early 70s and mid 70s with Richard Nixon, but you go from like the mid 70s to the late 90s. That's a good 20 plus year period where you're not really talking about impeachment. And then that was a big deal when that happened with Clinton. And then your generation, you guys have seen it twice with President Trump, for better or worse. The Senate. Confirmation. This is a big power of the Senate. Remember, they control those people that have those positions in the executive and on the Supreme Court. Big, important power of the Senate. All right. And I throw that denial of votes because, if we have a president of a different party than the Senate, and you guys don't remember this, but it was interesting that when Barack Obama was president, and the control of the Senate flipped to Republicans, there was an opening on the Supreme Court. And President Obama nominated someone, Merrick Garland. And, I think other people kind of thought, okay, the Senate's gonna at least hear this confirmation. They will probably vote him down because, Republicans control. They weren't big fans of Barack Obama for whatever reason. And they just decided to never have a vote on it, period. So they just never brought it up. Mitch McConnell, the majority leader at the time, just said, Psh, forget it. We'll take it up with the next president. And interestingly enough, that next president was Donald Trump, who actually got to nominate, I think three in his first term. Approved treaties, and then removal trial. So as the president is impeached, then we have the removal trial. Again, back to Donald Trump. They had a removal trial the first time around with what happened with Ukraine. He was not removed from office. And then the second time with what happened on January 6th, he was impeached for that, but he was leaving office within a couple weeks. So that was more ceremonial than anything. And there was no removal trial that happened. All right. I got 2 things left. I'm just kind of looking ahead here. All right. Yes, I got 2 things. So I'm going to go back to here. Some congressional lingo. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. This was in your vocab. Divided government. You guys get that. All right. So just read through that. Gridlock. When things aren't happening in Congress, think of it as a traffic jam. Things aren't getting through, things aren't getting done. That happens in Congress quite a bit. Earmarks. This is when things are tacked on to a bill to get them passed. It can really increase the spending. So this would be like saying, hey, Senator from Nebraska, we're going to tack on this, that, and whatever to this bill to get you to vote for this bill because this will really help with the university, or this will really help with Omaha. They'll get a bridge, or they'll get this, or they'll get that. So that's been a thing that's really been watched a lot more, I think, by folks in the public, because this can really increase the spending on bills. And so there's been a real watch of earmarks, which I also call pork barrel spending on bills. Last but not least, again, this is from your vocab. Trustee, delegate, politico, how does a representative, how does a senator act? How do they vote? How do they think? Trustee, not necessarily going with what the majority in their district or their state wants. Trust me to do the right thing. I think about trustee, more so probably with foreign policy. I think about, maybe Deb Fisher, she may know more about what's happening with the foreign policy issue than the majority of Nebraskans. And she may say, hey, trust me for what I know of what's going on with this foreign policy issue. You may not think that this is the right thing to do, but I think that it is the right thing to do, and trust me, in the long run. A delegate would be saying, what do the majority of Nebraskans want in my district or in my state, and I'm going to follow what it is that they want me to do. And politico, that's going to be a mixture of both. And to me, I think that most representatives and senators worth their salt, they're going to be politico. I mean, you want to trust them to make right decisions sometimes, on even if they're the most popular decisions. But then certainly too, you better at times, follow what the majority want with certain issues. Because if you're always going trustee, I don't think you're going to get reelected if you're always kind of going against the grain of your constituents. All right, that is 4.2. We are moving right along here with chapter 4.